Imagine this. An ancient angel delivers a mind-blowing vision to the prophet Daniel about the future of Israel, Jerusalem, and the coming Messiah. It promises an end to sin, everlasting righteousness, and the anointing of the Most Holy, all packed into 70 weeks. But when do those weeks actually begin? Well, we've already explored the 70 years of Babylonian exile, so now we're going to shift to these 70 prophetic weeks, which start from the going forth of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. The big question is, though, which decree? You see, Scripture records 4 major decrees from Persian kings that allow the Jews to return and rebuild after the exile. The first decree was under Cyrus in 536. And this decree kickstarted the return and the beginning of the temple construction. But the temple construction was stalled for a while, so the second decree under Darius in 520 resumed the stalled temple work. And then we get to the third decree by Artaxerxes in 457. This was a comprehensive decree for Ezra for restoring the temple, the city, the laws, and even waiving taxes. And then a fourth and final decree, which was in a letter from Artaxerxes in 444, specifically for Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. After careful examination of the texts of Ezra and Nehemiah, as well as historical records like Babylonian astronomical tablets and Ptolemy's canon, and even elephantine papyri showing Jewish fall-to-fall dating, we zero in on the 457 BCE decree of Artaxerxes as the one that truly fits Daniel 9:25. This decree uniquely empowered full restoration of Jerusalem as a functioning city, not just a temple. We're also going to tackle whether these weeks are literal years or tied to sabbatical cycles. You see, there are 3 strong possibilities that emerge for the start of these 70 weeks. The first is fall 458. The second is spring of 457, and the third is fall of 457. Each of these possibilities leads to intriguing alignments with Messiah's arrival around the early 1st century. In this video, we'll break down the evidence step by step and compare the options with charts and see how this ancient prophecy points powerfully to Yeshua. If you've ever wondered how Daniel's timeline connects exile, restoration, and the coming of the Anointed One, stick around. This could change how you see biblical prophecy.
"70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city to stop their transgression, to put an end to sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place." Daniel 9:24.
Now that we have covered the 70 years of Babylonian exile, we can begin to turn our attention to the 70 weeks prophesied by Daniel. These 70 weeks were said to begin from the going forth of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem.
Know and understand this. From the issuance of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until the Messiah, the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks the Messiah will be cut off and will have nothing. Daniel 9:25 and 26.
We must begin by determining which decree this prophecy is referring to. There are 4 decrees given by the Achaemenid kings to allow the Israelites to rebuild the temple and/or Jerusalem as a whole. The first decree was to return and build the temple, and it was issued by Cyrus in 536 BCE, found in Ezra 1, verse 1 through 14. The second decree was to resume temple construction after it was halted, and this was issued by Darius in 520 BCE, found in Ezra 6, 1-3. The third decree was to restore and beautify the temple and Jerusalem, as well as nullifying taxes and tribute, and to teach and enforce Torah. Magistrates were restored as well. This decree was given by Artaxerxes in 457 BCE, found in Ezra 7, 11-26. The fourth decree was to rebuild the walls and gates of Jerusalem by Artaxerxes in 444 BCE, found in Nehemiah 2, verses 7 and 8. The third decree, the specific decree of Artaxerxes I, the Achaemenid king of Persia, in 457 BCE, is the decree specified in Daniel 9:25 concerning the start to the 490-year period. This decree was an extension and addendum to Cyrus's decree given several years prior. Of the four relevant decrees given in Scripture, it is only this third decree that fits the description appropriately. This is because it is the only one that allows for funds given to the Israelites to be used for whatever purposes they see fit, which means that, unlike before, funds could be used to build walls, roads, and city infrastructure rather than solely for the temple. It also gave Ezra a specific precedent to restore the legal code in Jerusalem and to remove any tax or tribute burden preventing the successful legal and financial restoration of Jerusalem as a sovereign entity. This is confirmed by Ezra's words when he stated that the decrees of the kings of Persia not only allowed them to rebuild the temple, but also the walls of Jerusalem, thus indicating that Artaxerxes' decree including the rebuilding of Jerusalem.
Though we are slaves, our God has not forsaken us in our bondage, but he has extended to us grace in the sight of the kings of Persia, giving us new life to rebuild the house of our God and repair its ruins, and giving us a wall of protection in Judah and Jerusalem. Ezra 9:9.
By asserting that the ruins were repaired and a wall of protection was provided, Ezra was asserting that Jerusalem had been legally restored. It is fitting that it was the angel Gabriel who gave the vision of the coming Messiah to Daniel, and it was Gabriel who introduced the coming birth of Messiah to Zechariah. The question is, how do we arrive specifically at the year 457 BCE for the going forth of this decree? Ezra 7:7 tells us that Ezra went to King Artaxerxes in the 7th year of his reign. Therefore, we need to determine the first year of his reign in order to find out when Ezra went to the king to receive the decree. According to historical sources, Artaxerxes I ruled Persia from 465 to 424. However, his rule was predicated upon the murder of his father Xerxes by the royal court guardsman Artabanus. This is recorded in a Babylonian astronomical text, designated BM, for British Museum, 32234, which contains reports of lunar eclipses. Matthew Stolper documents that the text records Xerxes having been slain between the 4th and 8th of August of 465 BCE. His murder was most likely followed by an interregnum period. During this interregnum, which may have lasted up to 7 months, Artaxerxes avenged Xerxes by slaying Artabanus. Thus, Artaxerxes I did not ascend the throne until likely at least the fall, technically after Tishri I, the fall of 465 BCE. Ptolemy's canon dates Artaxerxes' accession to December 17th of 465, which is Thoth I in the Egyptian calendar, and this calendar uses non-accession dating. This gives us further confidence that he took the throne at least after Tishri I of 465. So we can reasonably accept that Artaxerxes took the throne sometime after Tishri I of 465. Now we must account for how Ezra dated the first year of his reign. In other words, when was his first regnal year? The ancient Persians dated kings' regnal years beginning in the spring. They used the accession year system. This would mean that Artaxerxes' first year would have begun in the spring of 464 BC, and his seventh in the spring of 458 BCE. However, there is evidence that a Persian spring regnal date was not what was intended by Ezra. Daniel, along with Ezra and Nehemiah, reckoned regnal years by the accession year system, just like the Persians. However, there is reason to believe that Ezra was here utilizing the standard Jewish regnal year beginning in the fall month of Tishri, rather than using the Persian convention of spring. This would place Artaxerxes' seventh year beginning on Tishri 1 of 458 BCE. But can we give proof that Ezra was indeed utilizing a fall-to-fall regnal dating scheme? It has been established that since 841 BC, the kingdom of Judah utilized a fall-to-fall regnal dating scheme. This is one reason for the name Rosh Hashanah, or head, chief, or leader of the year, which occurs on Tishri 1. Therefore, Ezra could certainly have been employing this method. There is evidence of this found in Nehemiah 1:1 and 2:1, which places the winter month of Kislev prior to the spring month of Nisan within the same 20th year of Artaxerxes. This accounting makes sense when using a fall-to-fall regnal year, but not with a spring-to-spring regnal year. Because of this seeming contradiction, many scholars have proposed that the biblical text is in error. Others have proposed that the Persians strayed from convention and were utilizing a non-accession year dating schema, placing the beginning of his regnal year in August right after the murder of his father. This would allow for Kislev to precede Nisan within the same regnal year, but would require an unsubstantiated departure from Persian convention. Scholars have a hard time accepting that Ezra would forego using the Persian spring-to-spring convention and instead utilize a Tishri-based regnal schema, and this is for good reason. For example, in America, we recognize the presidential inauguration to occur on January 20th. Why then would we use a biblically based calendar and record the president's tenure to have begun in another month, rather than using the normal convention? Further, there is substantial evidence that Haggai, who was a contemporary of Zechariah prophesying during the second year of Darius I, that Haggai used a spring-to-spring regnal schema. To see this evidence, it is essential to understand that months are always numbered in Scripture according to Aviv, or Nisan, being the first month. Tishri is never numbered as the first month. Horn and Wood elucidate this well in their Chronology of Ezra 7, where they reference Richard Parker's work, Persian and Egyptian Chronology.
If in the Old Testament months received numerals, they were always numbered from Abib, also called Nisan, regardless of whether the reckoning of the year was from the spring or from the fall. In a year beginning with Ethanim, later called Tishri, this seventh month in the ecclesiastical year was therefore not numbered as the first month of the civil year, although it was the first, but retained its number 7. A civil fall-to-fall year thus began with the 7th month, had the 12th month toward the middle, and ended with the 6th. Siegfried H. Horn and Lynn H. Wood.
Here are the relevant scriptures. Haggai 1:1, in the second year of the reign of Darius, on the first day of the 6th month Elul. Haggai 2:1, on the 21st day of the 7th month, Tishri. Haggai 2:10, on the 24th day of the 9th month, in the second year of Darius, Kislev. Zechariah 1:1, in the 8th month, Cheshvan, of the second year of Darius. Therefore, Haggai and Zechariah were placing the months of Elul, the 6th month, Tishri, the 7th month, Cheshvan, the 8th month, and Kislev, the 9th month, within the same regnal year, and thus using a spring-to-spring regnal schema. If a fall-to-fall schema were being employed, then the Kislev, 9th month, would have fallen in Darius' 3rd year and not his 2nd. Why then Would Ezra employ a fall-to-fall regnal schema when Haggai was using a spring-to-spring regnal schema just some 62 years prior? What could have made Ezra switch from reckoning regnal years using the Persian method to now using the standard Hebrew method employed by the kingdom of Judah prior to the exile? Perhaps Ezra would have utilized the standard fall-to-fall schema solely because he was writing to a Jewish audience who were in the process of returning from exile. If this were the case, it would be helpful to have evidence that contemporaneous Jewish scribes were also employing this method. In fact, we do have extra biblical evidence of this. In a Ministry Magazine article entitled Elephantine Papyri and Daniel 8:14, Sigrid Horn expounds.
There are only two possible interpretations. 1. One of the Nehemiah passages contains an error, as some biblical interpreters have suggested. Or 2. The author of the book of Nehemiah counted the months of Artaxerxes' regnal years, not according to the Babylonian spring-to-spring calendar, but rather by the old, pre-exilic Jewish civil calendar, according to which New Year's Day fell in the autumn. In order to ascertain which interpretation is correct, it is necessary to find ancient Jewish documents that carry double dates, one date expressed in a calendar the nature of which is not in question, such as the Egyptian solar calendar, and another date in which a foreign king's regnal year is presented in the calendar of the Jews. Such documents exist in the Elephantine Papyri, where several legal texts carry two dates, an Egyptian one that is fixed and unassailable, and one that would agree either with the Babylonian, Persian spring-to-spring calendar or with an autumn-to-autumn Jewish calendar. An example may show what is meant. The document Seis Kauli J contains the renunciation of a claim and comes from the year 416 BC, as ascertained from the first line, which contains the date formula. The line reads, "On the 3rd of Kislev, year 8, that is the 12th day of Thoth, year 9 of Darius the king." The first of the two dates is expressed according to the Jewish calendar, as shown by the Kislev month name. The second date uses the Egyptian calendar with the Egyptian month name, Thoth. Evidently, the Elephantine Jews were required to use the official dating system of Egypt, in which they lived, in order to give legal force to their documents. However, they apparently felt a need also to add in many of the Elephantine papyri a date computed according to their own calendar and reckoning. Notice that in this example even the number of the king's regnal year varies by 1 year according to the two computations. Unfortunately, the documents extant prior to 1947 carried double dates from that part of the year in which there was no divergence between the Babylonian spring-to-spring calendar and the Jewish autumn-to-autumn calendar. Thus, it was not possible to ascertain whether the Elephantine Jews used a calendar that was different from the Babylonian. However, the picture changed in 1953 when Emil G. Kraling published the documents that had remained hidden from 1893 to 1947 in the bottom of Wilbur's trunk. Among this latest treasure were additional double-dated documents. In one of them, Kraling 6, the Egyptian and Jewish dates can be made to harmonize only if we assume either that the ancient scribe made a mistake or that he used a calendar that began in the autumn and that he counted the regnal years of the Persian kings according to this autumn-to-autumn calendar. We have here a similar situation as found in the two Nehemiah passages already discussed, where one of two views is possible. Either Nehemiah made a mistake or he was using an autumn-to-autumn calendar. Siegfried H. Horn.
It seems most likely that Ezra was indeed using the fall-to-fall regnal schema. Thus, there were several months going into 464 BCE before he would begin counting Artaxerxes' first regnal year. Artaxerxes' first year would have been reckoned as Tishri 1 of 464, and his seventh year would have begun on Tishri 1 of 458 BCE. Now that we have established that the seventh year of Artaxerxes began on Tishri 1 of 458, we can then establish when Ezra left for Jerusalem with a decree in hand. Going forth of the decree. We know that the decree was certified in a letter given to Ezra that he took with him to Jerusalem. So in order to know the very latest date for when the decree could have been given, we need to discover when Ezra left for Jerusalem. Ezra left for Jerusalem in the first day of the first month of the 7th year of the king. The 7th year of the king began on Tishri 1 of 458. So, when was the first day of the first month of this year? The first month is Aviv, or Nisan. Therefore, Ezra left on the following Aviv 1, which was in 457 BCE. Some may debate whether the first month being hereto referred is Aviv, Nisan, or is Tishri in the fall. This is because the biblical civil calendar begins on Tishri 1, but the sacred or festival calendar counts the months beginning in Aviv, Nisan, which is in the spring. We've already established that Ezra's first month is referring to Aviv, because numbered months always refer to the sacred calendar which begins in the spring, whilst the civil calendar is never numbered and solely uses month names such as Tishri, Shevat, Nisan, etc. We can't simply assume that the decree was first issued at the same time the letter was given to Ezra in the spring. This is because the decree could have been legally enacted sometime prior, within the context of the legal royal court of Artaxerxes, and then certified in the letter given to Ezra sometime later. This is supported by the fact that the letter that Artaxerxes gave Ezra specified that he had been sent under the directive of the king and his 7 counselors, implying that the counselors had a part to play in the decision-making process. Perhaps the legal decision had been made a few days or at most a few weeks prior to sending Ezra with the letter. It doesn't make much sense, though, to suggest that the king waited months to officially release Ezra with a copy of the decree in hand, knowing that the king, quote, granted Ezra all his request, and that Ezra had earnestly desired to return to Jerusalem. We can reasonably assume that the decree was enacted in the year 457. The latest the decree could have been enacted is Aviv 1 of 457, because this is when Ezra left with the decree in his hand, and this date may be the best date to consider the word to have, quote, gone forth, as Daniel 9:25 stipulates. It literally reads, from the going forth, the proceeding or departure, of the word to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem, from the literal standard version. We can't really say that the word to restore Jerusalem had truly gone forth until Ezra had taken a copy of the words in hand as he went forth from Babylon to Jerusalem. The detail given of Ezra's departure date may indicate that Ezra intended that the reader recognize this as the specific date to consider the word to have, quote, gone forth. Ezra does not supply any other earlier date that could be understood to have applied to the going forth of the decree, and I propose that this was intentional. After all, a specific date was given for Cyrus's decree in the first year of Cyrus. Ezra also provides a date for when the word had, quote, arrived in Jerusalem, which was the 5th month, Av, in the summer of the same year. So, based on the decree being given in the spring of 457, counting strictly 490 years, the timeline of Daniel's 70 weeks would span from spring of 457 BCE to spring of 34 CE. But there's more to consider regarding the start of the 70 weeks. Unfortunately, it gets a little bit more complicated. Rick Lancer covers this entire topic extensively in his article entitled, Did Ezra Come to Jerusalem in 457 BC? There he concludes that Ezra left for Jerusalem in the spring of 457, arrived in the summer of 457, and initiated the start of the 490 years, which he concludes is a sabbatical cycle, on Tishri 1 of 457. We will investigate Lancer's theory in more detail, and I will provide my reason why I still reckon 458 as the most likely year that a decree went forth rather than 457. Some commentators assert that the 70 weeks of Daniel are not mere years, but sabbatical cycles, or shmitas. This is predicated upon the notion that cycles of 7 years or Sabbaths of years are utilized to count toward the Jubilee year that occurs every 50 years. Therefore, the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 may be referring to 70 Sabbaths of years, as conveyed in Leviticus 25:8.
And you shall count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the 7 Sabbaths of years amount to 49 years. Leviticus 25:8.
Also, the 70 years of captivity in Babylon was predicated upon the fact that the Israelites had neglected the Sabbath years for 490 years. Therefore, they were exiled for the exact amount of years in which they neglected to keep the Sabbath year, i.e., 490 divided by 7 is 70.
So the land enjoyed its Sabbath rest all the days of the desolation, until 70 years were completed, in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah. 2 Chronicles 36:21.
The promise that the land would enjoy its Sabbaths if Israel was disobedient was fulfilled according to the word of Yahweh in the Torah. Question: does it then follow that Yahweh intended the reader to understand the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 to be referring to 7-year sabbatical cycles? Answer: not necessarily, but it is possible. Let's take a look at Daniel 9:24 compared to Leviticus 25:8. In Leviticus 25:8a, it says, Sheva Shabbatot Shanim, or 7 Sabbaths of years. In part B, it says, Sheva Shabbatot HaShanim, or 7 Sabbaths of the years. In Daniel 9:24, it says Shavuim Shevaim, which is 70 weeks. When we look at the Septuagint, however, it reads a little bit differently. Leviticus 25:8a says 7 rests of years, and B says 7 periods of 7 years. And then Daniel 9:24 says 70 periods of 7. Because the text of Daniel 9 doesn't specifically use the word Sabbath, but instead it uses the word weeks, it can be argued that it is not referring to sabbatical cycles. However, because the text of Leviticus 25:8b in the Greek identifies the 7 Sabbaths of years as 7 periods of 7 years, and similar language is used in the Greek of Daniel 9:24, where it refers to the 70 weeks as 70 periods of 7, it may be argued that the sabbatical cycles are in view. The text is not explicit, however, there is no instance in Scripture where weeks of years are referred to except for the sabbatical cycles. Therefore, it logically follows that the weeks here may be referring to 7-year sabbatical cycles. Whether or not sabbatical cycles are in mind is significant. Sabbatical cycles are not counted whilst Israel is in exile, and they're counted from the month of Tishri. Therefore, if sabbatical cycles are in mind, then the first year of Daniel's 70 weeks would begin on Tishri 1 rather than Aviv 1 of 457. There is one more possible way to begin the 70 weeks, and that is to start with the beginning of the civil year in which the decree went forth. This method counts the entire year inclusively. Therefore, although the decree went forth on Aviv 1 of 457, the year count would begin on Tishri 1 of 458. These 3 options constitute a chronological difference of a total of 1 year. Because the text is not explicit, I will leave this to you to decide which interpretation fits the data and context best, and I will provide charts that depict each of the 3 interpretive chronological scenarios. Here are the 3 options. Do we count the years inclusively beginning on the civil new year in which the decree was given? from Tishri 1 of 458 BCE? Or should we count strict 490 years, beginning from precisely when the decree went forth on Aviv 1 of 457? Or do we begin counting on year 1 of the sabbatical cycle, which occurred 6 months later on Tishri 1 of 457 BCE? When were the sabbatical cycles reinstituted? Rick Lancer argues that the count should begin in Tishri or fall of 457, because Ezra did not arrive in Jerusalem until summer of 457, and the sabbatical cycles would have only begun after his arrival and the renewal of the covenant with Yahweh. It is argued that the sabbatical years were not counted during exile, and that Ezra reinstituted the sabbatical years following his arrival in Jerusalem that summer. Lancer argues that further evidence that they were reinstituted at this time is found in Nehemiah 8, 1-3, wherein Ezra reads the Torah to the people at the Feast of Tabernacles, which is commanded to do at the end of every 7 years during the year of release, or the sabbatical year.
Then Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time in the year of remission of debt, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you are to read this law in the hearing of all Israel. Deuteronomy 30:10-11.
Because this feast begins on the 14th of Tishri, and the new year is dedicated on the 1st, and the Jubilee consecrated on the 10th, it follows that the reading of the Torah is to be performed at the start of the 7th year of the sabbatical cycle, and not at the beginning of a new cycle. Therefore, the year in which Ezra reads the law in Nehemiah 8 is the sabbatical year. By determining which year this is, we may be able to work backwards to determine if the year in which Ezra returned, the fall of 457, fits as the first year of the sabbatical cycle. Nehemiah began construction on the walls of Jerusalem in 444, the 20th year of Artaxerxes, found in Nehemiah 2, and he finished 52 days later in Elul, which is equivalent to September. Lancer argues that 1 month later, at the Feast of Tabernacles, Tishri 1 of 444, that Ezra read the Torah, which would make 444-443 a sabbatical year. The Israelites had settled in their towns by the 7th month, found in Nehemiah 7:73, and it was at this time that they gathered to read the Torah and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. It seems fitting that a sabbatical year would fall precisely on the first new civil year following the completion of the construction of the walls of Jerusalem, and in the year that the officials restored property to the oppressed Jews, in Nehemiah 5:11 and 12. This would make the sabbatical year fall in 444 to 443, which was the 21st year of Artaxerxes. Counting backwards, this does line up with 457-456 being the first year of the sabbatical cycle, as Lancer articulates. Let's look at this chart together and you can see Lancer's proposed sabbatical cycles. You can see that in year 1 of the sabbatical cycle we would start in 457, and then we would count forward 7 years all the way to 451, and at that time we would start a new sabbatical cycle in 450, and then count forward 7 years all the way to 444, causing the sabbatical year to fall in 444, matching up with the 21st year of Artaxerxes. Therefore, Lancer's proposed sabbatical cycles do work and they do fit. The timing of Ezra's public reading of the Torah at the Feast of Tabernacles fits Lancer's proposal that the 70 weeks are intended to refer to sabbatical years. Lancer concludes,
"The weeks of Daniel 9 were understood by the ancient Jews as referring to sabbatical year cycles, which, being tied to agriculture, were always counted from the month of Tishri. Sabbatical year observance only applied when people resided in the land of Judea, so the count had to be restarted after the exile. Since the restoring of Jerusalem had a necessary spiritual aspect, the work of Ezra was part of the fulfillment of Daniel 9 verse 25, and the return from the exile was not finished until Ezra and his companions arrived. Given that Ezra did not depart for Judea until Nisan 1 in early spring of 457 BC, Artaxerxes' decree was most likely issued during the winter of 457 BC. Thus, Tishri 1 of 457 BC would have been the earliest time the observance of sabbatical year cycles could have been implemented after the exile. Rick Lancer.
It is worth noting here that Orthodox Jewish German professor of mathematics and calendrical science at the Breslau Seminary in the 19th century, Benedict Zuckerman, published his treatise on the sabbatical cycle and Jubilee in 1859. He placed Tishri of 458-457 as the seventh year of the sabbatical cycle, and thus Tishri 457-456 as the beginning of a new sabbatical cycle. Christian professor at the Hebrew Union College and Dead Sea Scroll scholar Dr. Ben Zion Wacholder placed Tishri 457-456 as the seventh year of the cycle, and 456-455 as the start of a new cycle. Each of these scholars' calendrical sabbatical year calculations can be found tabulated in a chart made by Bob Pickle on his website. Lancer makes the argument that we must begin counting the 70 weeks no sooner than when Ezra arrived in Jerusalem, because he suggests that sabbatical cycles cannot be counted in exile. He then draws upon Zuckerman's tabulation of sabbatical years in support of the notion that the 70 sabbatical cycles began on Tishri 1 of 457, which I will denote as 457T. This would place the end of the 69th week from 26T to 27T CE, and the first year of the 70th week from 27T to 28T CE. Zuckerman reckons 27T as year 1 of a new sabbatical cycle, whereas Wacholder reckons 27T as the 7th or the Sabbath year of the cycle. With Lancer's proposal, understanding the correct start date of Daniel's 70 weeks is dependent upon ascertaining the correct calendrical calculation of the sabbatical cycle. Because scholars disagree on this very point, Lancer's proposal introduces a new level of complexity, but one worth considering. Lancer proposes that the sabbatical cycles were reinstituted with Ezra on Tishri 1 of 457, arguing that the sabbatical cycles could not have been instituted earlier than when Ezra returned and reestablished the covenant. I argue, however, that the covenant was restored and the sabbatical cycles were reinstituted on Tishri 1 of 535 BCE with the priest who returned with Zerubbabel. Just like Nehemiah 7:73 records that the Israelites had settled in their towns by the 7th month, just prior to them reading the Torah on the sabbatical year in 444T, and keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, Ezra 3:1-7 records that the Israelites who returned with Zerubbabel settled in Jerusalem by the 7th month of the first year of Cyrus. The first year of Cyrus began Tishri 1 of 536. He gave his decree for them to return shortly thereafter, and therefore they had settled by Tishri of 535. They built and dedicated the altar to Yahweh and made the first burnt offerings on the 7th month, Tishri 1 of 535, wherein they kept the Feast of Tabernacles and performed all the priestly services for the new moons and all appointed sacred feasts. All appointed sacred feasts would also include the sabbatical years and the Jubilee years. Although the temple had not been rebuilt, the altar was restored, and people had inhabited the land of Israel. The command to keep the sabbatical years applied as soon as Israel was to enter the land God had promised them. Therefore, there is no logical or legal reason why they should not have immediately begun reinstituting the sabbatical cycles, found in Leviticus 25. I suggest that the sabbatical years were reinstituted in Tishri of 535, beginning not with year 1, but rather with year 7, the sabbatical year. It may seem illogical to begin the count with the Sabbath year. However, the scriptures designate the Sabbath year as a year of release, and this year was the first new year following Cyrus's decree to release the Jews. It was this very year that the Jews were restored to the land and began re-inhabiting their former territories. This is the same language used in Nehemiah 7, where it records that the Israelites had settled in their towns by the 7th month. And then they vowed to faithfully keep the sabbatical year in Nehemiah 10:31. Furthermore, during the Sabbath year, the Israelites were not to sow or reap, but were to eat from whatever the land would yield on its own, found in Leviticus 25:4-6. The returning Jews were supplied by both Cyrus and their neighbors with goods, livestock, and valuables to sustain them. They had no need to sow and reap, for their efforts were to be devoted to restoring the altar and laying the foundation of the temple.
And let every survivor, wherever he lives, be assisted by the men of that region with silver, gold, goods, and livestock, along with a freewill offering for the house of God in Jerusalem. So the family heads of Judah and Benjamin, along with the priests and Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred, prepared to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. And all their neighbors supported them with articles of silver and gold, with goods and livestock, and with valuables in addition to all their freewill offerings. Ezra 1:4-6.
A final proof that the sabbatical cycles were reinstituted in Tishri of 535 is that the year of release was expected to have been kept prior to 445. During Nehemiah's time in Jerusalem in 445 BCE, the 20th year of Artaxerxes, the Israelites state that they have been borrowing money and mortgaging their houses and vineyards in order to pay the king's taxes on their fields and vineyards. They state that their sons and daughters have been sold as slaves to foreigners and are unable to be redeemed because they don't own their properties. The nobles and officials have been exacting usury from their own Jewish brothers. According to the laws pertaining to the maintenance of the sabbatical cycles, exacting usury and permanently taking land from your brothers is expressly forbidden. The sabbatical cycles had fallen into neglect. Nehemiah rebuked the assembly.
So I continued, "What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our foreign enemies? I, as well as my brothers and my servants, have been lending the people money and grain. Please let us stop this usury. Please restore to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, along with the percentage of the money, grain, new wine, and oil that you have been assessing them." Nehemiah 5:9-11.
The whole assembly agreed to restore it and make an oath before Yahweh to cease exacting usury and to restore what they had taken. Although this serves as proof that the sabbatical cycles had suffered neglect at some point since the time of Ezra's journey in 457, Nehemiah's rebuke demonstrates that they should have been being kept. The first restoration occurred with Zerubbabel in Tishri of 535, at which time the covenant was ratified and the appointed sacred times were re-established along with the construction of the altar to Yahweh. Here's the kicker. If we accept Tishri 1 of 535 as the 7th year of the sabbatical cycle as it was reinstituted, then it fits perfectly with Lancer's proposal that 457 was the first year of the cycle and that 444 was also the 7th year. The following chart summarizes the major events with respect to the 7-year sabbatical cycle. Reinstitution of the 7-year sabbatical cycle. In 535, Israel re-inhabited by the 7th month. The altar was restored, and the Feast of Tabernacles was kept. All appointed sacred feasts were reinstituted. This was the 7th year of the sabbatical cycle, found in Ezra 3:1-6. In 516, the temple was rebuilt, and Passover and unleavened bread were kept. This was the 5th year of the sabbatical cycle, found in Ezra 6:13-22. By 457, we have the decree to restore Jerusalem, and the covenant was renewed with Ezra. This was the 1st year of the sabbatical cycle, found in Ezra 7. And in 444, the walls were complete, the property restored, and slaves returned under Nehemiah. The land was re-inhabited by the 7th month, tabernacles was kept, and Torah was read. This was the 7th year of the sabbatical cycle, Nehemiah 5, 6, and 7, and 8. Based upon all of this analysis, I've found that although Lancer's proposal is possible, it lacks explicit substantiation from the text and is therefore subject to some degree of speculation. The natural reading of the text seems to indicate that Aviv 1 is the going forth of the decree, so it would be just as acceptable for someone to consider it to be the starting point from which we should count the years of the 70 weeks. If we abandon using the sabbatical year beginning on 457T as the starting year of the 70 weeks, and we embrace Aviv 1 of 457 as the date of the decree going forth, one might still question if it constitutes the beginning of the 1st year of the 70, since civil years begin in the fall. Because the biblical method counts years in Tishri, and there is substantial evidence that biblical counting utilizes inclusive reckoning, meaning that partial years or days are counted, we may conclude that the counting of the 1st year of the 70 weeks of Daniel began on 458T. I'll thoroughly cover the concept of the biblical use of inclusive reckoning in a future video. Ironically, with all of the aforementioned analysis, I personally have concluded that the beginning of Artaxerxes' 7th year, Tishri 1 of 458 BCE, may be the most likely candidate for the correct year to begin the count of Daniel's 70 weeks. The 69th week would have concluded the day before Tishri 1 of 26 CE, and the 70th week would span from 26T to 33T CE. I just want to note here that if Lancer's proposal is correct, this would place the final week 1 year forward and span from 27T to 34T, and this timeline still fits the arrival of Prince Messiah and the timing of his crucifixion in 30 CE. In all, we are left with 3 very plausible possible start dates for the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9. The following chart outlines some important dates between the beginning of the Babylonian captivity and the beginning of Daniel's 70 weeks. It will be helpful to reference this chart as you study this time period. In the next video, we will break down the anatomy of the 70 weeks and examine them to see how they connect directly to the coming of Yeshua and the beginning of his public ministry. We'll also see how this prophecy in Daniel 9 of the 70 weeks depicts the crucifixion and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The final week, the 70th week, is often presented by futurists as a time far removed from the ministry of Yeshua. A 2,000-year gap is artificially introduced to the text in order to fit the dispensational futurist paradigm. But in the next video, I will present evidence that I anticipate will give you confidence to know that the 70 weeks were fulfilled consecutively, that the 70th week culminated in the life and ministry of our great Messiah, Yeshua, just as God prophesied to Daniel. Until then, stay connected to the source, stay in the Word, and stay in prayer. And as always, Shalom.